Democracy. I know you've heard this term used time and time again by countries and leaders who tend not to live up to the concept. The origin of the term comes from the Greek word demos, meaning the people, and kratia, meaning power to rule. The Oxford Dictionary will tell you that democracy is a system of government by the whole population or all the eligible members of a state. Lincoln will tell you democracy is government of the people, by the people, and for the people. What differentiates a democracy from a mob-ruled hellhole or an ochlocracy is that a democratic society will implement mechanisms meant to ensure that the rule of law protects minorities. Now, I'm a big fan of democracy, huge democracy enjoyer. So when I see self-proclaimed democratic countries not only fail to live up to their purported ideals, but actively spit in the face of them, I don't like it very much. Makes me a little bit mad. Was the United States truly living up to the concept of democracy during the Jim Crow era, when explicitly racist laws governed the land, or after the Jim Crow era, where implicitly racist laws took their place? Can such a system be considered democratic? Was Canada upholding democratic values when it allowed for the torture, rape, and brutalization of indigenous children in residential schools? How could a system that prides itself on representing the interests of the common man exclude an entire people time and time again? Could it be that the term democracy is more often used as an empty platitude or a buzzword than it is an actual promise of just governance? As Israel continues its invasion of Lebanon, displacing over 1 million people and justifying its actions by claiming Hezbollah forced their hand, the reality tells a different story. Since tensions reignited on October 7th, 2023, Israeli attacks have far outnumbered those by Hezbollah. Meanwhile, the bombardment of Gaza has now claimed over 41,000 lives. Get ready for Western countries to remind you, once again, of how important the only democracy in the Middle East is to us all. How many times have you heard some American jackass frame the conflict in the Middle East as though Israel is a haven for democratic principles and equality, but it just so happens to be surrounded by a sea of savagery? This isn't true. There is a beacon of democracy in the Middle East. It's just not Israel, but we'll get to that in a bit. Given that most of the countries stressing the beauty of Israel's democracy have themselves frequently undermined the concept they claim to hold dear, why would we take them at their word when it comes to Israel? Supporters of Israel's purported democracy generally fall into one of two camps: those who claim it's a full-blown democracy that provides equal rights to all of its citizens, and those who acknowledge its flaws but blame them on the aftermath of the 1967 war. To address the first claim, it's crucial to recognize that Israel is deeply involved in the occupation of millions of people, whether that be through direct occupation or by acting as an occupying authority, as has been the case with Gaza since 2005. Despite claims of disengagement, Israel maintains significant control over Gaza, including regulating what enters the region, from essential goods like water to items as trivial as cookies. This level of control challenges the narrative of equal rights and democratic freedoms. Oh, would you look at that? They're letting cookies in now. How kind. In the West Bank, around 700,000 Israelis live in settlements that are illegal under international law. They violate Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, which prohibits an occupying power from transferring its population into the territory it occupies. This blatant disregard for the rights of occupied Palestinian people who have no say or vote in Israeli affairs highlights yet another erosion of democratic principles. All we've seen thus far is democracy for anyone who isn't an occupied Palestinian, which is no democracy at all. How could one claim to value democracy while excluding marginalized people whose land was taken from participating in democratic processes or having their desires represented through electoral means? How could a Palestinian living in the occupied West Bank electorally challenge their occupiers if they can't even cast a vote against them? All the while, the occupying force is free to expand and build illegal settlements in what little land the Palestinians have. To build off this, Adalah.org, the legal center for Arab minority rights in Israel, clocked 65 discriminatory laws in motion. They also took the liberty to, on Human Rights Day in 2015, compile 10 unjust and discriminatory Israeli Supreme Court rulings made in that year alone. Such rulings like the Supreme Court's upholding of the absentee property law, which allows Israel to confiscate Palestinian properties in occupied East Jerusalem if the owners reside in the West Bank. After annexing East Jerusalem in 1967, Israel has pursued policies to separate it from the West Bank and facilitate illegal settlement expansion on the occupied land. The law supports this strategy by transferring Palestinian-owned properties to the state. The Israeli Supreme Court also dismissed a petition advocating for the rights of security prisoners, most of whom are Palestinian, to access higher education, citing no distinction between security and criminal prisoners. Now, you don't need me to tell you that denying education perpetuates a system where discrimination against an undereducated segment of the population can thrive. However, even when education is accessible, Israel's control over Palestinians extends beyond legal manipulation. It often enforces its rule through blatant force and disregard disregard for international law. A UN special committee was tasked with investigating Israeli practices in Palestinian and other occupied Arab territories, and they found, quote, a stark increase in sexual harassment, sexual abuse, the threat of rape, and rape itself, including with foreign objects against men, women, and even children, and intimidation through the use of dogs by Israeli security forces. The steep rise in cases of abuse filed against Israeli security officers indicates that a systematic scheme of inhumane treatment is being executed as state policy to deprive Palestinians of their liberty. In addition to these injustices, the occupied territories feature a segregated road system where Palestinian vehicles are prohibited from accessing Israeli roads. Even on Palestinian roads, cars with Palestinian plates face constant stops, restrictions, and checkpoints. Cars with Israeli plates do not experience any of this. Now call me a libcuck if you want, but I am of the belief that segregation and democracy might be incompatible. For those who argue that Israel upheld democratic principles more effectively before the 1967 war and only after the war did democracy take a backseat to security, I hope to challenge that belief and point out how inaccurate it is. Even before the 67 war, Israel's treatment of the indigenous population included land confiscations, martial law, and restrictions on movement. The 67 war and subsequent occupation merely intensified these practices. It did not mark their beginning. To quote Israeli historian Alan Pape, the litmus test of any democracy is the level of tolerance it is willing to extend towards the minorities living in it. By this standard, he argues, Israel has failed miserably even before the 1967 war. Prior to June 1967, Israel not only engaged in colonial conflicts with its neighbors, but it also enforced a shoot-to-kill policy against Palestinian refugees attempting to reclaim their land, crops, or belongings. After securing new territorial gains, Israel passed laws that ensured the supremacy of the Jewish majority, while granting the right of return to Jewish people born anywhere in the world. This policy starkly contrasts with the denial of the Palestinian right of return, which is recognized in UN General Assembly Resolution 194. The resolution clearly states that refugees wishing to return to their homes and live at peace with their neighbors should be permitted to do so at the earliest practicable date. It also calls for compensation for those choosing not to return or for any damage to their property. Additionally, over 90% of the land in Israel is owned by the state or by quasi-governmental organizations like the Jewish National Fund, which is tasked by the Israeli government with developing and leasing land, but exclusively to Jewish people. This effectively makes the state complicit in a discriminatory campaign that prevents Palestinian Arabs from owning land. A two-tiered system where one group enjoys the benefits of a dignified existence while the other is subjected to torment and brutality does not resemble democracy. It resembles apartheid. Despite everything we've just learned about Israel, the West often portrays it as a beacon of shared democratic values to justify their close alliance. This narrative serves to maintain Western influence and hegemony in the Middle East, a region historically resistant to Western intervention. Israel's presence is strategic. In the words of a great and wise philosopher by the name of Joseph Robinette Biden, chocolate chip. Oh, not that. Sorry. I was looking for a different quote. Oh, here it is. If there were not an Israel,
the United States of America would have to invent an Israel to protect her interest in the region.
If the West genuinely prioritized democracy as they claim they do when it comes time for justifying wars or regime changes in the name of freedom and prosperity, they would instead champion and learn from the democratic model of Rojava. Rojava is an autonomous region in northeastern Syria inspired by the ideas of democratic confederalism and the philosophies of Abdullah Öcalan. Central to Rojava's democratic system is the principle of bottom-up governance. Authority is decentralized, allowing decisions to be made locally by neighborhood and village councils. These councils consist of diverse groups that represent different ethnicities, religions, and affiliations, and ensure that minority voices are acknowledged and respected. Rojava even goes as far as ensuring that leadership roles are filled by both a man and a woman to ensure that the interests of all are more effectively represented. Despite being situated in a conflict zone, Rojava's adherence to direct democracy, ecological regeneration, and democratic confederalism have stood the test of time. For over a decade, Rojava has been a symbol of democracy in the region. Here in the West, we hardly, if ever, even hear about Rojava, let alone praise and learn from their accomplishments. And that's because democracy isn't actually what our Western governments care for. Hegemony is. With the death toll in Gaza surpassing 41,000 people, over 16,000 of whom are children, instead of trying to mitigate civilian casualties, Israel has moved on to using 2,000-pound bombs, which have a destruction radius of 115 feet. In addition to the horrors in Gaza, Israel has now decided to direct its wrath towards Lebanon. The reason they've given is that Hezbollah has been firing rockets at them, even though the majority of Israeli attacks on Lebanon far outnumber Hezbollah's attacks on Israel. About 82% of attacks between Israel and Lebanon since October 7th, 2023 have been carried out by Israel. This doesn't even take into consideration that Hezbollah's initial rocket fire was an attempt to stop the slaughter in the Gaza Strip, while the entire Western world acted as though Israel's disproportionate response was merely an act of self-defense. It's become clear that our leaders are spineless cowards who don't take the Palestinian or Lebanese plight seriously. I mean, even Reagan and H.W. Bush knew when to tell Israel to stop. Are you telling me these absolute are to the left of our current Democrat and purportedly liberal parties on this issue? With that being said, organizations like the World Food Program are doing what they can to ensure aid to these decimated areas. In Lebanon, prior to Israeli bombardment, 23% of the population was already facing acute hunger. In Gaza, the situation is even worse. If you can, please consider donating. I'll leave the links in the description. If you know and prefer to use any other donation mechanism instead of the ones I've linked, feel free to do that. Thanks.